Chapter 10. This is Sparta. In the early summer of 2006, I successfully completed the Platoon Sergeant's Battle Course, PSBC, in Recce, achieving a below-average grade. I'd clashed with my instructors throughout the duration of the tactics phase on this promotional course, as I would challenge their theory against the group's experience. One must not forget that the majority of these students had current warfighting knowledge from Iraq and Afghanistan, and the syllabus was outdated, as it was primarily derived from the Falklands War. I had also taught this syllabus the year prior, and had an in-depth understanding of the advanced tactics and best practices that were being taught. Furthermore, the instructors delivering this course had just missed out on deploying in these war zones, and, as a result, were a little envious of this current batch of students. Then there was my Marmite outspoken character to contemplate. So, overall, I was satisfied with the grade. In the last days of the final exercise, which were held in Malawi, a small country in East Africa, I was informed that my grandfather had days to live, and that arrangements were being made for me to return home. My immediate thought was that I would fail the course and therefore not be promoted. I was totally focused on passing this course and deploying to Iraq the following year as a platoon sergeant, and, as such, I wanted to complete the final few days of the course. No thought whatsoever was given to my family, as fulfilling the Army's needs was exclusively my priority at this point in my life. Thankfully, the company sergeant major pulled me to one side and informed me that I'd already easily passed the course before we had deployed on this final exercise in Malawi. Now I was interested. He went on to tell me that this was one of the few times where the British Army's welfare system worked well, because it was a training exercise and not an operational deployment. I was then flown to what can only be described as a chicken freighter to South Africa, before a connecting flight to London, and I cannot fault the welfare team for their rapid response and sound planning. They were second to none, and in retrospect, I would like to thank them. However, when I landed in London, I received a voicemail that my grandfather had already passed. I was too late. My mind raced over this unproductive journey, as all I could think about was how this would affect my course grade. For this past decade, my grandfather had become the stable father figure that I'd always craved, and now I was more concerned about a course grade than his grieving widow, my nana, and other family members. My grandfather had requested to be buried in Milford, a small town in Cork, Ireland, and as my nana didn't want to fly, I drove her there. I carried the coffin at the funeral, and didn't even shed a single tear. At the wake, I recall some bartender giving me a drink on behalf of some suspicious men hiding away in the secluded corner of the pub. I was informed that they knew I was part of the British Army, so not to leave this bar, and was advised to return to the UK the following day. And that is exactly what I did. I had clashed with similar suspicious men in Sligo 3 years prior to my nana's 70th birthday party. This was weeks before I had deployed to South Armagh, and as a result, I had vowed to never return to Ireland again. I wasn't afraid of death. In fact, at times I sought it. But this was my grandfather's dying wish, and I wasn't going to let him down. Reflecting back on my grandfather's death, I am saddened by my lack of emotional reaction. I was far more concerned with my own selfish career needs, the British Army's needs, and my focus, which was evidently on the next deployment to Iraq. My memories of the 2003 war had been firmly suppressed and ignored, but something deep down in my conscience was telling me that I deserved to die for my actions in the war, and that I was going to die on this next operational tour. I accepted this as my fate, and had shut down emotionally as a result. I came to loathe myself and shut out the outside world, which included friends and family. Drinking again became my coping mechanism, and not once was this ever questioned. Maybe this was because I was not the only one feeling and acting like this at the time. After the funeral, I would return to my battalion and be given the position of Platoon Sergeant of my beloved 10 Platoon. This was a dream come true, as the men of 10 Platoon had always been my family. However, none of my men from 23 Charlie now remained. I recalled that it wasn't long after I had returned to the battalion when a recruitment team from the Defence Human Intelligence Unit, or Op Samson, gave us a presentation and asked if anyone was interested in joining their organisation. I put my hand up and asked when the next selection course was, and was pleasantly informed that there were some places available on the following Sunday. This was Thursday, and the recruiter then went on to inform us that it was normal protocol for students to prepare themselves from between 3 to 6 months to be physically and mentally prepared for the course. I had 2 mundane barrack guard duties the following week, so I blindly threw my name into the hat and volunteered, to the recruiter's bewilderment. Surely this arduous selection course would be more exciting than guarding our camp. 3 days later, I turned up at Chicksands, home of the Intelligence Corps, and after a quick orientation brief, it was time for a fitness test. At this stage, I had serious doubts about being there, as all of the other students had been training for at least 6 months, whereas I had spent my 2 days of preparation in the bars in and around Aldershot. Regardless, this was far better than being on guard duty, so I might as well give this a go, I thought to myself. To my amazement, myself and a Lance Corporal from the Irish Guards finished the fitness test in 1st and 2nd place, despite having no preparation time whatsoever. But he dropped out as the course intensified. I'm still governed by the Official Secrets Act, so I'm not permitted to discuss the selection process. But what I will say is that I enjoyed it. Towards the end of the selection, I was given a very uncomfortable psychological assessment, and this was the only one that I ever had during my 20-year career. I failed this test, and as a result, was not selected, but was advised to return for the next course, as I'd passed everything else. During my debrief, I was informed that I would have done my utmost to achieve the mission, and this was not how human intelligence worked, which still confuses me. I was a conditioned infantry soldier, and mission success was always the priority for me. Apparently, it was assessed that I would have sent all of my recruited assets to their deaths in order to achieve my mission. Seemingly, this was not accepted, as the Ministry of Defence had a legal duty of care towards all recruited intelligence assets. I was later approached by a member of the Intelligence Corps to consider transferring across, but it soon became apparent that they were just after my range qualifications. They had taken casualties the previous year and desired experienced infantry soldiers to transfer across to help them train for the current operational climate. This intrigued me, but was something that I would never consider and turned down, as I was blindly loyal to my regiment. Besides, I resolutely believed that I was facing my impending death in Iraq, and this was my destiny, my penance. No sooner had I returned from this selection process than I was called in front of my commanding officer to discuss my PSBC course report. He was slightly disappointed with the grade, as I had a reputation as a competent junior commander. But I had other strong reports that conflicted with this. The report stated that I didn't belong in the field and was more suited to the drill square. I recall on hearing this, the regimental sergeant major interrupted and highlighted the fact that this was quite personal, and that there must be a clash of personalities. He wasn't wrong about the clash of personalities either, as the instructors from Brecon were of the generation that had instructed us recruits, and were generally bullies. They loathed our operational experience and, of course, our medals. On 2 occasions I can recall instructors threatening me with violence for challenging their theories on low-level tactics. And of course, they backed down when I had taken them up on their offer of settling our differences the old-fashioned way. The commanding officer then referred to me as an enigma. He read out quotes from my outstanding reports from the infantry training centre, then looked at me with a smile and said, "Now we have your course report from Special Forces selection to consider. This report recommends that you should return to Op Sampson's selection in 6 months' time, as you currently have no signs of empathy. And it also recommends that you would be an excellent candidate for the SAS." He went on to tell me that he didn't know what to make of me, and joked about the welfare of my men as I lacked empathy, as we were due to be deployed to Belize in Central America for some jungle warfare training. It may seem odd that a battalion that is training for a desert tour in Iraq would conduct training in the jungle. The logic behind this is that if you can operate in the unforgiving jungle climate, then you can operate anywhere in the world. Besides, the British Army at this time was constantly deployed, and was limited to where they could conduct large-scale exercises. That would make this exercise interesting, as that Frank was now appointed as the temporary Platoon Sergeant of 11 Platoon, and our friendly rivalry could continue. Once the exercise had ended, I flew straight to France to spend the Christmas leave period adventure training with the battalion ski team. I was completely shut off from the civilian world and all relationships outside of the military. Only by keeping busy and focused on the Army's needs was I able to keep my inner demons at bay. So this is what I did. In that new year, I was disappointed to hear that Frank had already handed in his notice to leave the Army, and I was saddened to see him go. He had deployed to Iraq in 2005 with the Coldstream Guards and was part of the Basra riots alongside Soldier B. He had a tough time adapting when he had returned home and received no support for his deteriorating mental health. Frank had witnessed his platoon sergeant being killed by a roadside bomb and had almost been overrun by the mob in the horrendous Basra riots in that same year. He had failed PSBC, was in the middle of a divorce, and wasn't receiving any help for his battlefield trauma, and was told to man up. Then, on one fateful afternoon in the sergeant's mess, Ireland would play England in an epic clash, and his future fate would be decided by the scoreline. The majority of the sergeant's mess had donned their Ireland shirts, and there must have only been 3 of us wearing England's colours. And after a few drinks, I suggested that we raise the stakes. It was decided that when the opposite team scored any points through a try, conversion or penalty, that the other person had to do a shot of tequila. The game would finish 43-13 in England's favour, and one must not forget that at the sergeant's mess bar, all singles are automatically upgraded to doubles. Furthermore, the sitting bartender was Butch, a good friend of both of ours, and made sure that we both received good portions of tequila. Frank would get so drunk that he would throw up in the sergeant's mess, but not before he had informed the regimental sergeant major that he was going to withdraw his termination papers. Not only that, but he outrageously claimed that we were both going to win Victoria Crosses in the impending deployment to Iraq. I was overjoyed that Frank would honour his drunken decision, and he withdrew his termination papers. This would mean we could selfishly spend more time together. Besides, he was an exceptional soldier, and my best friend, my brother. Yet again, through the luxury of hindsight, it was obvious that my best friend was suffering with his mental health from his 2005 tour in Iraq, and no help was made available for his deterioration. Nor was it even acknowledged, for that matter. This was just the man-up culture at the time, and one must not forget that the military was under insane operational commitments in 2007. The mental well-being of its soldiers was not a priority, or even an afterthought. The senior commanders were the junior commanders of the mid-90s, and as such, the British Army had a detrimental philosophy towards mental health, i.e., it was ignored. Our Optelic 10 pre-deployment training would be the polar opposite to our previous tour and would be fundamentally different to what we'd experienced prior to the 2003 war. All of our training was now prioritised around the concept of de-escalation and avoiding the fight. It was made evidently clear to us that we were no longer at war with a conventional army, but with an insurgency in an asymmetrical conflict. Since the end of the Second World War, British forces had gained a vast amount of experience in counterinsurgency operations. COIN. As a result, the British Army have continuously built on their successes and failures from their COIN lessons learned from Palestine, Malaya, and Kenya. And let us not forget about the 30 years of insurgency of Northern Ireland by the IRA. Ever since General Sir Gerald Templer applied his successful hearts and minds policy in Malaysia in 1952, the principle of minimum force has been identified as a crucial component in COIN strategic planning. This policy would be effectively implemented for the British withdrawal of Basra, but was not instilled or effectively enforced by the low-level commanders at the lesser tactical level during the summer of 2007. In the weeks prior to the battalion's deployment to Iraq on Optelic 10, I had been handpicked to work with the Americans in Baghdad as part of a joint task force. The aim was to use our combined best practices to help get the insurgency under control in rural Baghdad. Our team consisted of a captain, James, Sean, who was a colour sergeant, and Jim, who, like myself, was a sergeant. We were all Irish Guardsmen, apart from James, who was a Royal Marine Commando, and together we were a professional and experienced team. Our job was to train and integrate an Iraqi Shia infantry battalion from the Basra area to operate in a Sunni-dominated area of rural Baghdad. We formed a part of a US-led military transition team, MITT, and despite handing over the reins of 10 Platoon, I was optimistic about the forthcoming experience. Our four-man team was one of the first of our battalion to arrive at the Contingency Operating Base, or the COB for short. The COB was built around the airport, and within hours of returning to Basra, we were under enemy fire. These were generally Chinese 105mm rockets, and were not very accurate. The camp was tented, but within each tent there were pens made out of breeze blocks, into which, for our protection, we were required to jump into when hearing the mortar alarm. On this such occasion, the four of us did just that. I remember sharing a nervous laugh with the other lads, as this was a lottery, and the protection on these fabric tents was minimal, to say the least. I couldn't help but think back to my previous time in Iraq, and wished that I was in my trench again, as this would offer far better protection and safety. These indirect fire, IDF attacks, would intensify throughout the Irish Guards deployment on Optelic 10. These constant IDF attacks would result in 5 deaths of British personnel at the COB, and these would be responsible for a further 127 British casualties in that same year, A counter-rocket artillery and mortar CRAM phalanx would be installed in the May as the indirect fire intensified. But unfortunately, some would inevitably always get through. The increased attacks was a political strategy from the local insurgents known as the Mahdi Army. It had previously been agreed at the political level for British troops to withdraw from their security duties in the city area of Basra and hand over the responsibilities to Iraqi forces. As such, the Mahdi Army would politicise this to support the narrative that they had forced the British out. This would solidify their claim to the city, and one must not forget that they had already infiltrated the Iraqi security forces as well. After a few days, we were flown to Baghdad to liaise with our US counterparts. On arrival at Camp Victory, we were all in awe of the sheer scale of everything from the cookhouse to the number of troops and equipment that was on display. We would be joining the 10th Mountain Division, more specifically, 2nd Battalion of the 14th Infantry Regiment, the Golden Dragons. These were some battle-hardened and experienced soldiers, with some already on their third 12-month deployment in 4 years. I was intrigued to learn that a member of the MITT had previously been part of Operation Gothic Serpent in Somalia in 1993, best known by the movie Black Hawk Down. Yet Smithy looked nothing like his chiselled Hollywood persona. Our American cousins were a mixed bunch, with the standout soldier being a British Platoon Sergeant equivalent named Sergeant First Class Scott Madden. Scott was extremely competent and more than capable of holding his own in the ranks of the British Army, and we became good friends. Integration was effortless due to a shared mutual respect through our shared military history, and of course there was no language barrier to overcome. The perk of being attached to the US was that we could pick our own personal call signs. Big Guns was our Apache air cover, and our company commander was called Terminator Tango. So we chose to use the call sign Spartans, after the popular Zack Snyder film 300. In Baghdad, and whilst on the radio, I would be known as Spartan 4. Our combined mission was to integrate and train our Iraqi battalion of soldiers to competently operate independently in rural Baghdad, which seemed near impossible at first. We would be given an abandoned Iraqi army patrol base called Lion's Den, from which to train and deploy our Iraqi battalion. The US had been forced out of Lion's Den the previous year, as it was an outstation with only one sandy road in and out, just off Route Arrows, probably the most dangerous road in Baghdad. Route Irish got all of the media attention because this was the only route that reporters generally travelled on to and from their hotels and the airport, and as such, it was greatly exaggerated. However, Arrows was the real dangerous road, and we had to patrol this almost daily. When interviewed by a US Army reporter, James summed up our mission with the Iraqi Army perfectly. We're not trying to get them up to Western standards. We're trying to get them up to Iraqi standards, so that the British and American soldiers can go home, and they can have a functional army of their own. We're not here to change their culture. We're just here to train them. It wasn't long before we would come under heavy fire at Lion's Den. James and I were in our makeshift gym at the time, working out, when there was a thunderous bang close by. We were under mortar fire. The rounds were close enough to be hit by ricocheting debris and to feel the heat from the impact of the blast. This was followed by immediate small arms fire. We were both in just tight shorts and flip-flops, but had our equipment close by, and I quickly put on my body armour and helmet and grabbed my rifle and began to observe from our predetermined defensive position, whilst James was getting fully dressed. He looked up at me and said, "You're actually enjoying this, aren't you?" I may or may not have been smiling, but the rush you get whilst in combat cannot be explained to those who have not witnessed it. The Iraqi soldiers that we were training repelled the attack, sustaining only one casualty, with a non-fatal gunshot wound, which was reassuring for everyone at Lion's Den. But more attacks would follow. After a few more months of training from patrol lessons derived from Northern Ireland, our Iraqi unit were patrolling confidently, and we were able to take a back seat. They would do things their own way, which was appropriate for their own culture, but to which we sometimes had to turn a blind eye. Besides, it was their country, and who were we to tell them to be less aggressive? They would still require coalition soldiers to support them with intelligence, air support and artillery. But for Iraqi standards, they were exceptional. Initially, the US were reluctant to patrol on foot due to the IED threat, but we gradually persuaded them that the best way to dominate the ground was through deception and quiet, stealth-like patrolling. Maybe they'd been spoiled with their seamlessly unlimited resources and equipment. But you cannot win over the hearts and minds of the local population by destroying their crops with huge armoured vehicles on a daily basis. Looking back, we were trying to change their patrolling outlook to fit the more reserved British mindset. And at times, this was a battle in itself due to the cultural differences. Many of the commanders foresaw foot patrols as needless risk, and when considering the high fatality rates that summer, I can understand why. Furthermore, these guys were on a 12-month patrol cycle with only a singular 2-week slot of R&R in between. As such, the divorce rate among the US soldiers was astronomical. This would probably explain the exceptional welfare packages that were available for the Americans to help alleviate the operational stress. In comparison with British standards, we had the equivalent of a company's worth of welfare support for just 12 of us. They were also completely dry, which was something we could help with, as beer was readily available from the British Embassy in Baghdad. I remember acquiring a crate of beer and stashing it in Lion's Den as a surprise for my American cousins. I had planned for all of us to share a few beers that evening, but I still had 2 more patrols to complete that day. Finally, when I finished, I was mortified that Smithy had drunk the whole crate by himself. These were only 330 millilitre small cans, but Smithy had reverted to full-on redneck and drank the lot. Smithy was a huge, well-built soldier, but was very softly spoken, a gentle giant, and we would joke about his ability to guzzle beer in the coming months. There is a myth that American soldiers cannot hold their ale. Smithy is the exception to the rule, and is in a league of his own. I recall being the watchkeeper in our control room in Lion's Den, when the MITT team were on a particular patrol to inspect an Iraqi permanent checkpoint en route Eros, when they came under indirect and small arms fire. The Quick Reaction Force was already deployed, and Terminator Tango had advised me to call in the big guns, the Apache gunship helicopters. The technology that the US Army possessed was out of this world. They had their own version of Google Maps, called the Blue Force Tracker, which was useful in identifying friendly positions on the battlefield in real time. I requested immediate support from the Apache gunship helicopters, who now were already hovering above the MITT team. I called it in. Big Gun 66, this is Spartan 4. Fire mission, over. Only to be told by the Apache pilot, "Don't give me any of that Brit bullshit voice procedure. Just tell me where they are." So I reviewed the Blue Force tracker and responded, "Multiple insurgents in the wood line to the north. Engage." Big Gun 66 emptied his entire payload of ammunition, then returned to base, and it was rumoured that the Apache gunship pilots would be teased if they had any of their payload left on return to base. But it was job done. The insurgents had been eliminated, and the MITT patrol saved. When they returned to Lion's Den, they were euphoric, and were all giddy about their firefight, and of course, I was ridiculed for missing out. I let them have their moment, as the jokes came in thick and fast about how I was apparently cowering under the desk when I had called in the airstrike. This somehow even made it into the regimental journal that year, and I was teased even more. But this was good old military banter. The main thing is that none of our team was injured. Yet, I couldn't help think about the American airstrike from 2003. That night I remember being very withdrawn, as I was conflicted about what had occurred. I wasn't on the ground, and my mind raced, contemplating whether or not I had made the right decision. I wondered whether or not there had been any civilian casualties as a consequence of my actions, and still do. Regardless of how I felt, we still had a job to do, so I would have to man up, as the mission was the only thing that mattered. After a few months, it became very evident that we were the poor cousins in every aspect. The US war budget appeared to be endless, and it was clear that they were here for the long term. An example of this was their enormous US embassy, which was undergoing construction at the time. This was a vast structure, which was rumoured to have 20 sub-levels. The airspace was dominated by attack helicopters. All of their personal protection equipment was regularly updated to counter the IED threat. The food was fantastic. The dining facilities were of restaurant quality, and the sheer number of troops was overwhelming. However, this came at a cost. There was a noticeable disparity between the more competent professional soldiers and their Army Reserve counterparts, yet each respected the other as they understood that they were symbiotic. In my last week in Baghdad, we were all on edge, as the US were losing personnel at the rate of 3 soldiers a day. Things were tense, to say the least. In between training the Iraqis, we would also be required to conduct a combination of foot and vehicle patrols for our own base protection. Whilst on vehicle patrols, I always opted to be the Browning .50 caliber gunner on one of our 3 Humvees convoys. Our rules of engagement were different from the Americans, as they were permitted to use lethal force more frequently, whereas we had more restricted guidelines, derived from Templar's model of prioritizing winning over the hearts and minds of the population. This at times made it problematic, as the US were very trigger-happy, and it is understandable, as Baghdad was a completely different insurgency when compared to Basra. However, we were still accountable by British law, so we had to remain diligent and accountable for our battlefield decisions. On one such patrol, we had stopped to conduct a snap vehicle check when a loaded minivan rapidly screeched around the corner towards us. All of the Americans screamed at me to engage with the .50 caliber machine gun, and I would have been well within my rules of engagement to do so. The Browning .50 caliber is designed to shoot through engine blocks and is a tremendously destructive heavy machine gun that is utterly overpowering. This vehicle had all the signs of a vehicle bomb and was heading towards us at some speed. I instantly conducted a tactical analysis of the situation and prepared my heavy machine gun. It didn't stop when asked. The driver was erratic, and from the struggling suspension, it was clearly overloaded, possibly with explosives. I removed the safety and fired half a magazine into the engine of the minivan, then continued to observe as it crashed into a ditch at the side of the road. There was a sudden onset of silence. My American cousins then aggressively surrounded the minivan with their weapons raised, and to their horror, this was not a vehicle bomb, just a minivan full of kids on their way to school. Fortunately, I had opted to use my own low-caliber assault rifle to shoot the engine of this incoming vehicle. If I had opted for the .50 caliber, it would have shredded the car and killed all those inside, including the children. We were all relieved, more so my American cousins. I had made a life-saving decision, and I deeply believe that this was a result of witnessing those civilian vehicles being engaged on the outskirts of Basra throughout the 2003 war. I fundamentally accept that over the years my battlefield experiences have changed my trained perception of warfare, and although at the time I didn't think too much about this incident, in hindsight, I am proud that I didn't destroy that minivan with the Browning .50 caliber, as I would also have these deaths on my conscience. When reflecting on my time with the US MITT team, it was thoroughly enjoyable and a fantastic experience to work with some extremely talented and knowledgeable soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division. What I found odd, though, was how American officers could transfer to infantry units from logistical roles without undertaking any special training whatsoever. I don't think this would necessarily work within the British Army, as many of the senior non-commissioned officers like myself were far too outspoken. Besides, at platoon level, both the platoon sergeant and platoon commander had to pass a similar arduous tactical course which formed the foundation of mutual respect. This enabled the British platoon sergeant to heavily influence tactical decisions, whereas this was absent within the US rank system, with the American junior officers having complete operational freedom. Although we shared the same language and, arguably, the same history, there was a noticeably huge cultural divide which affected how we operated tactically. The Americans had become so reliant on technology and urban operations that some of their basic rural soldiering had been neglected as a trade-off, and this is where we could help balance the MITT. We both knew our strengths and weaknesses, and by being open about them, this made us a stronger team. Collectively, our American cousins were far more relaxed, despite continuing to suffer immense casualties throughout that summer. Maybe this was down to how they had identified the importance of maintaining the morale of the troops throughout a 12-month deployment. The investment in the welfare of the operational soldiers was a world away from what I would ever experience as a British soldier. This was probably due to our limited 6-month deployment cycle, which came with its own additional pressures, as senior commanders always attempted to make a significant impact in such a limited time frame. Furthermore, on British deployments, we were always pushed to our physical and mental limits, with no consideration given to the welfare of the men, which often led to operational burnout. We were always undermanned and ill-equipped, and pushed to our limits, which was the polar opposite of our American cousins. But at least we occasionally had alcohol to help alleviate the operational pressures. In terms of welfare, the US, even in 2007, were years ahead of the British and understood how maintaining the morale of the troops increased battlefield efficiency. The American government has since been recording the harmful psychological effects of warfare and currently openly advertise this on their own recruiting web pages. In 2021, in the US, 17 veterans commit suicide daily. In fact, the suicide rate for veterans who have deployed is 1.5 times higher than civilians. Although this is staggering in terms of numbers, the US government has acknowledged that there is a correlation between veterans and suicide, which is a welcome start. This is an ocean apart from the Ministry of Defence, as we have to rely on a veteran support group for these numbers, and the British government still refuses to document the suicide rates of our own veterans. This raises many questions about the cause of the high rate of suicides amongst the armed forces, especially the argument for liability concerning the psychological damage from the British Army's harsh behavioural training methods, or the battlefield trauma from our operational experiences. Or maybe both.